This is part 2 of the pesticides video, and we're going to look at the other dot points, including gather info from secondary sources to identify a pesticide whose use is now banned and summarize its use, the reason for its stopping, and available evidence to assess the impact of its chemicals. So the best way to gather the information is looking at some reputable sites, including the Greenpeace website, and I've given you a few links on how the Dirty Dozen were banned. Let's not forget that pesticides do have a positive environment impact on farming, and that's why they were pretty much used. They allowed an increase in the yielding from crops because less died due to pests. They enabled growth on unsuitable land and extended growing seasons. However, we do need to consider the negative impacts. They were designed for killing weeds, insects, and diseases, most of which are applied by spraying. How do you think this affects the other organisms of the area? So overspray and runoff can transport pesticides to other environments and even make their way into our water system. The pesticide is then to be brought into contact with non-target organisms. This can have negative impacts and may cause problems worse than the initial pest problem itself. For example, non-target organisms can be killed by the misuse of pesticides. They can also be absorbed into environments and can also endanger non-target ones, as we said. A famous example of this is DDT. DDT was first synthesized in 1874, but its power as an insecticide was not reported until 1939. It's cheap, highly toxic to insects, but with extreme low toxicity to mammals and humans. It was used widely in the 1950s to treat crops. So I've given you a few information here from IUPAC, which is International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. So it's a chemistry-based sort of source. They are the authority of how to name chemicals, naming elements, writing up the main information that people need to know about hazards, and they do a lot of scientific work to tell us about the impacts of chemicals and all things that I guess we need to know about chemicals. So that they're like the authority on that, okay? So what's DDT? Okay, it was an insecticide. It was mainly used after the World War II to kill disease vectors, so that they're carriers of diseases such as malaria, and they used it as an agricultural spray to kill pests that ate crops. So it wasn't just for those, it was also for mosquitoes. They sprayed them as a pesticide against mosquitoes that were carrying malaria. Although it is still used in some countries for prevention of malaria, typhus, and other vector-borne diseases, many countries stopped its use, and mainly because there were growing concerns about the adverse effects of DDT, especially on the fertility of birds. The characteristics of DDT and its metabolites mean that they are ubiquitous, so they're found everywhere. It accumulates in the food chain, becomes a major problem in birds of prey. As the DDT concentration in birds increases, the eggshell thickness decreases. Also, DDT and metabolites are very persistent in the environment, and as much as 50% can remain in the soil for 10 to 15 years after application. This persistence, as well as it being lipophilic, so it attaches to fat, provides necessary conditions for DDT to bioconcentrate in organisms. That's bioaccumulation, just to clarify. Okay, so that were the main uses of DDT. Okay, and have had beneficial effects. Okay, but not been all good. As we said, it's very persistent. They're transferred from the point of application through the air, through water, and through food webs, all by accumulation within one, because it's lipophilic. So it binds to fat and it stays within a life. within one organism during its life. So declining numbers of raptors was associated with the eggshell thinning, in turn associated with DDT and DDE levels. Hyperactivity of affected birds on the nest probably increased egg breakage, and other chlorinated hydrocarbons such as deldrin and PCBs may have contributed to the effects observed as well. So sometimes a combination can have a much greater negative impact. Effects may also occur a long way from the point of use. Direct exposure does not need to occur to cause food web poisoning. And that's what's really dangerous. If you think about it, when you have something that you are putting into the environment and you're not too sure where it will end up, and its effects can flow on to greater aspects of the ecosystem, it's quite a dangerous thing if you're not 100% sure on the effect it will cause, So we're thinking about toxicity on many bird species. So it can be quite dangerous when you're not too sure about the extent. So sublethal effects. So it might not be lethal completely, exactly, but there can be sublethal effects such as reproduction, destroying a species, which could. Preventing malaria. So the mosquito-borne parasite which causes malaria is said to kill 200 children under the age of 5 every hour in developing countries and up to 2.4 million Africans every year. Every year, up to 500 million people around the world fall ill with malaria, and as a result, they may become more vulnerable to the virus that causes AIDS. So as you can see, the benefit of spraying DDT is affecting all of these people who are benefited by getting rid of the vectors that carry that parasite. So in the 40s and 50s, many countries almost eliminated the mosquitoes that carry the parasite that cause malaria. And this is like what you would be talking about this to assess some of the usefulness of pesticides. In the late 1960s and 70s, countries that could afford alternative pesticides began to ban DDT because of its effects on predatory birds and accumulation in milk. When DDT was banned in the wealthy countries of the world because of its effects, these countries began making cessation of DDT spraying a condition for granting aid. Malaria rates in Africa are now higher than are ever known to have been, except for Swaziland, where DDT use was never stopped. The World Health Organization, Greenpeace, and Worldwide Nature Fund for Nature, WWF, met in December 2000 in Johannesburg, and WWF and Greenpeace have suspended their arguments against the use of DDT in malarial areas, provided application is limited to indoor spraying, particularly onto wall surfaces to protect people, minimizing environmental effects. And I have attached a paper that talks about this meeting in Johannesburg and then the 2001 that followed in Stockholm. So I really want you to read those two. Okay, we've gone through this, and there's a picture of those eggs that had the soft shells, and we've also talked about how we biomagnified the effect. So even in affecting things like secondary consumers like cats, if they were absorbed into the lizards and insects, they killed cats. And then that had a flow-on effect to the greater food web. That's another example. Rat populations exploded because cat population decreased. And this is one of the example of negative effects of pesticides. Of course, anytime we introduce a species, and this can occur for using biological ways of reducing pests, such as the cane toad, this can also affect the food web and food chain and change the distribution and abundance of organisms in a given area. So yeah, okay, we've gone through this. You can read this. Even worse problems were noticed in the 1960s, as we talked about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. bioaccumulation is increasing the concentration throughout an organisms in a food chain. There we go, another example. This is another problem. When we say it's a persistent chemical, it has a really long half-life, okay? So DDT has a half-life of 15 years. So 100 kilos of DDT, 15 years later, 50 kilograms would still be around. So again, the synthetic pesticides take a lot longer to break down in the natural environment. And also, it's fat soluble, so it does stay in your body. Well, not your body. It will stay in the body of most animals that have fat because they like to attach to them. And this this DDT is also can cause directly birth defects and other life-threatening defects. Today, new pesticides undergo some more rigorous testing. There are other pesticides as well that can cause those defects as well as death, and one of those is Agent Orange. And you will see I've given you a link about Agent Orange. It was used as a warfare as a weapon in war, and people are still being born with defects to this day. Okay, during the 1960s, in the Vietnam and Korean Wars. Okay, so so now we are looking for more alternative ways to basically try and instead of using those pesticides that were used, which are really harmful chemicals, it's really important to have a look at those other options. They can be often labor intensive, but they have longer term benefits, and we saw that even in our soil erosion studies, that often the soil erosion management strategies can be like labor intensive, sometimes expensive, sometimes you always have to maintain it and sustain it. You can't just do it, leave it and go. But in the long term, it actually saves a lot of extra effort that you'll need to fix the problem. Preventative is always better. Also, because you have to assess the alternative management practices that don't require the use of pesticides. So think about things such as how vigilant you would need to be to identify and manage the pests. So you need to know exactly what pests you're looking for. So there's a need for farmers to develop knowledge of the habitats and life cycles of pests, and to have the skill to apply this knowledge to control the pests. Often the use of chemicals is replaced with some kind of time-consuming activity. For example, weeds need to be controlled by labor-intensive techniques such as hand weeding and cultivation, and hopefully we'll be able to explore some of this when we go to our excursion in term 3. So the use of some specialized tools such as flame weeders can reduce this at times. Parasites of animals must be managed by selecting resistant animals, varying the stock density, adopting suitable grazing strategies, and appropriately timing operations that reduce the risk of disease such as shearing and crutching. So even if you knew the season that the pests were more prevalent in, you would manage your activities based on that. So really the wealth and the secret is in the knowledge and experience of farmers. I'm sure you would have heard, there's all these ways to even trap mosquitoes and flies at home the safe way. Those similar practices can be implemented also in agricultural contexts. And sometimes they can well, I guess what we have to do is we have to work on preventing the pest becoming greater or the pest infecting the crop or the animals. So if we can focus on prevention, it's a way better way to have a look at preventing as a long-term strategy. It can be difficult to justify, but the long-term productivity of a farm may depend on the reduction of chemicals that build up in soils anyway that destroy their ability to support crops. So long-term, it will actually benefit the farmer anyway. It might be difficult in the beginning to set it up, but it can also help in not and not ruining this, destroying this this soil's the soil's quality. Also, some alternative management practices can achieve multiple benefits. So, for example, crop rotations can help break disease cycles and be used to manage weeds. Some tall leafy crops can shade out weeds so that fewer weeds survive to cause problems for a following wheat crop. I mean, that seems simple enough, but actually it can be quite effective if done properly. Healthy cover crops protect young plants, reduce weeds, and encourage predators of some pests. Okay, so naturally, this is like all part of the natural cycles of animals, pests, and vegetation. Um, some strategies make common sense are very cost effective. So these may include establishment of tree groves, which provide shelters for birds and other animals that help in pest management. The trees can also act as windbreaks. The use of natural chemicals and pheromones can also be used to confuse and intercept pests. So try and look up some of these things that I've mentioned. I should make a list of them as well. I'll put them on Google Classroom when I've made a change or an amendment to the document, so you can actually look up some of these. Also, management practices that don't require pesticides have the potential to improve the productivity of a farm over a long time frame. In addition to this, if you want to think about assessing the management practice, think about the cost, think about the maintenance. Is it easy to maintain? Is it easy to make sure that the effectiveness of that management strategy doesn't easily kind of get counteracted, or do the pests develop a resistance or a way around it, or some sort of intelligence to get around that? Just like the way some of the mosquitoes that were sprayed with DDT developed resistance, as we know about natural selection and evolution. Okay, so consider these points when you think about answering your assess question, and I'll put what I've said as a transcript um, under that dot point as well, so you can have a read. All right, guys, that's the end, and we'll be back for the fifth fifth module in Caring for Country. Thank you.